Good afternoon, all. This is Cassie Powers with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO, and welcome to our kickoff webinar for our new initiative with AASHTO and the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation on building a national EV infrastructure network. We're delighted to have you here. We are going to be walking through some of the next steps in our initiative that we'll be doing to engage state agencies as they help to build out a national EV infrastructure network with funds through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'm going to make a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. And so this webinar is being recorded and a copy will be available afterwards upon request. All lines are on mute. You can feel free to ask questions or provide comments throughout using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering clarifying questions in real time, and then there will be an opportunity to address questions at the end. In addition, if you would like to use the raise hand the feature, you should be able to use that, and at the end during the Q&A we'll be able to address those questions. I'm going to drop my contact information as well as my colleagues in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to us at any time with questions or concerns regarding the webinar. And so with that, we'll go to our next slide, and I will introduce our opening speakers. And so let me turn it over to David Perry at NASEO. David?
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you to all the State Departments of Transportation and State Energy Office members that are on the call today, as well as our other partners and stakeholders for joining us and taking time to learn more about what we're kicking off today. As Cassie noted, I'm David Terry, Executive Director of the National Association of State Energy Officials, and this kicks off our new initiative in an official way entitled Building a National EV Infrastructure Network. We're obviously very excited to be working with our partner association, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO as we know them, to support the energy offices, the departments of transportation, and our partners in building out EV infrastructure. Of course, we're also incredibly pleased to be working with the Joint Office, the U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Energy Joint Office. Alex Schroeder, among others, have joined us today in that. They have been amazing partners throughout this activity, and including the support for today's initiative that we're kicking off. We've supported at NASEO our 56 state and territory governor-designated members for literally well over a decade on EV infrastructure and planning. That predates, I think, many, but in the Recovery Act in 2008, 2009, there was actually some EV planning beginning and being thought about then, and our members were working on it at that time. Also very robustly during the VW settlement, which is still ongoing, obviously, but planning across energy offices, environmental agencies at the state level, of course, and our friends from the Department of Transportation, local governments, et cetera, as well as public-private sector initiatives. All of that really prepared us well, I think, for this historic initiative under the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, as we sometimes call it. This is really a historic opportunity, obviously, to modernize our vehicle fleet across all classes and sectors by building out infrastructure, charging infrastructure, enabling private sector investment, working strategically with our local government partners across the states, across federal agencies, and of course with utilities and other energy providers. I think approaching this work in a coordinated way, a strategic way, really will deliver value, maximize value for taxpayers, certainly for American vehicle industry and our economy, but also for drivers. The customer is an important part of this equation, obviously, in enabling what they need so that they can really make the most of transforming our transportation sector. Last winter, NASEO and AASHTO signed a memorandum of understanding with the Joint Office to begin this work, really focused on setting the stage for enhancing coordination across our organizations, providing for feedback loops of information, both from our state members, respectively, to the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, the Joint Office, but also feeding information back. And I think that's part of the reason this has been such a great success. I think many of you that have heard me in presentations, either on calls for our organization or in presentations around the country, I've really highlighted with pride our work in this area. The streamlined approach and thoughtful way that the Joint Office has pursued this work is exceptional, as is the work of our partner departments of transportation at the state level and energy offices. But I don't think this could really have gone any better to date. And I think we are positioned perfectly to help states succeed. With financial support from the Joint Office, our organizations today are kicking off this initiative. You'll hear on our presentation about building out and building upon the existing state-led EV infrastructure work and private sector infrastructure work. Obviously, the electric utilities, both consumer and investor-owned, are critical components and partners to help optimize charging locations, how power is provided, and a variety of other issues. I think there's also great opportunities for public-private financing, and setting the stage for that in this work is another component that we need to be working on and building on models that we've seen at the state and private level. And I think also, most importantly, developing tools and resources that our respective state members request and private sector partners need to really bolster this effort, to maximize it, to make sure that we get the value out of it that we all envision. And I think we're on the right course for that. Throughout today's webinar, as Cassie mentioned, feel free to reach out to either her or Kirsten Veklas on our team with any comments or questions or connecting points you're looking for. And again, just appreciate your taking the time. I want to turn it over now to the Executive Director of AASHTO, Jim Timon. Jim and his team have been, as I said, not just being complimentary, genuinely amazing partners to work with, and couldn't ask for a better approach and a better way to kick off today, Jim. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon as part of this webinar to introduce this exciting project and partnership that we have with AASHTO and NASEO and the joint office there with DOE and DOT. It's as everybody here knows, the president set a goal of installing 500,000 EV chargers around the country by 2030. And this is, part of that process here of achieving that goal. Another part of that is the NEVI program that was part of IIJA, and we've really seen some progress over the last several months in implementing that program. We've got a lot of money that was provided through that program in IIJA that's going to be available for us to be able to build out this EV charging network. And it's the opportunity to strategically deploy EV charging infrastructure to fill in those gaps in the network and help reduce range anxiety and ensure that drivers don't get stranded, and establish some consistency from location to location. AASHTO and the state DOTs have really been working hard over the last several months to put together their EV charging plans, which were submitted to the joint office by August 1st. That was a deadline that a lot of us in the state DOT community have been we're working towards aggressively. It was a tight deadline, but I'm happy to say that all 50 states met that. And really, want to again thank the folks that were involved in helping the state DOTs getting there, and that partnership between state DOTs and energy offices and this joint program office, I think, really helped us to meet that goal. Now really the next step is to leverage this relationship here that we have with NASEO and with the joint program office, and to really implement those NEVI efforts in order to make sure that we can make good on the promise that the president has made in deploying those 500,000 EV charging units here over the next 7 or 8 years. So really, this webinar is the kickoff for that partnership that we've been talking about, and enable us to foster collaboration and implementation on that EV charging network through training and information dissemination. AASHTO's role in this partnership is to be able to bring the state DOTs together into regional and national conversations with the broader EV community, and to share knowledge that they've gained through other EV efforts, and to find ways to learn from those backgrounds and other disciplines to ensure coordination and collaboration across state lines, and to develop technical assistance specifically focused on the needs for state DOTs and state energy offices. As I'm sure you know, the state plans that were submitted in August were really just the beginning of the EV deployment program. And now this collaborative effort with NASEO and AASHTO and the joint office will really help states succeed in that next stage of implementation. So I do want to take a minute to thank the representatives from the state agencies who are on this webinar today, and the ones that have been working so hard over the last several months to get their EV programs up and running. I think that this is really an important moment for our country as we start to transition into this next phase of what transportation is going to look like in the future. And this is a key piece of that. And the fact that we have such a strong foundation to work from with this partnership with NASEO and with the Joint Program Office is extremely important. The great work that the state DOTs have done to get to this point and putting together those plans by August 1st is another great point for us to be able to build off of. And the funding that we have in IIJA will really help us to continue to move forward and work towards that goal of getting those 500,000 EV charging units installed here by 2030. So I really look forward to the rest of today's webinar. You're going to be hearing from David Peters, who is one of the rising stars here at AASHTO and within the state DOT community. But right now, it's my pleasure to hand things off over to Alex Schroeder, who's the acting director of the Joint Office of US DOT and DOE. Alex?
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks to you and David and AASHTO and NASEO for hosting us today. Really excited to be here. Also want to acknowledge the work and vision of Cassie, David Peters, and I even see Melissa Savage, who is with us on the line today in a slightly different capacity. Really have been working since February to get this going. So excited to see this take the next step. I am the acting director of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, joined by my awesome colleagues, Joanna, Steve, and Bridget here on the line. As Jim mentioned, the Joint Office was established in the IIJA with really a shared recognition of the opportunity and need to invest in our infrastructure, but also to reimagine collaboration across the institutions that are enabling these investments and these critical projects. This partnership with AASHTO and NASEO is very much an extension of that sentiment. And really that partnership with all of you has been our vision and our message since day one. The Joint Office is less than a year old. Our very first public foray was at a NASEO meeting in February to announce this MOU. And then very quickly follow that up, joined our colleagues at AASHTO and signed the MOU. This project here was really a follow through to that commitment. We are serious about this partnership. We're in this together. And I think as both Jim and David referenced, really the incredible work that so many people on this line and outside of this call have been putting in over the last 6 to 7 months. It's been exciting and we're just getting started, right? So which is maybe both a little daunting, but also very exciting. I think as Jim mentioned, we're at this really interesting inflection point. We had 52 plans come in August 1st. And that's it's incredible, right? All 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico had their plans in the door, on the deadline. I can appreciate it's a little harder to do in a virtual environment, but I think that is worthy of a virtual round of applause for everyone on this call that made that happen. I mean, just awesome. Yeah, there we go. So, I think the significance of that can't be understated, right? We are in this together. All 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico are prepared to really dive into this next phase. The challenge in front of us is not a small one though, right? I think there is a lot of work to be done and it really is a critical part of our future infrastructure and it's important we get this right. And so I think really this project and this effort is really intended to help us develop the communities where we can learn from each other as we go, share what's working, learn from maybe what's not working as well, and do what we can to kind of collectively support each other. And really as a community, at this kind of exciting phase of developing a charging network can truly work as one and work seamlessly at the national level, at the regional level, at the state level, and at the local level. So I feel like on one hand, we've come so far in a short amount of time, and on the other, again, we're just getting started, but again, big picture, really looking forward to moving into this next exciting phase with all of you, and certainly through this partnership with AASHTO and NASEO. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cassie Powers with NASEO, who's going to guide us forward in the webinar today.
Well, thank you to Alex and to Jim and to David for your comments as well as your leadership on these issues. With that, we will go to our next slide and we will chat a little bit about some of the work that NASEO and AASHTO in partnership with the Joint Office will be undertaking over this next year to support the states. And so there are a number of different outcomes for this project, but wanted to go through some of our initial objectives. And as we have talked about previously, we are really here to help advance transportation, electrification, and deployment planning at the state and local level. States have long been involved in setting policy and program direction for EV investments in their states, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the funding that came with that is going to help the states and the federal government build on those efforts. And so one of the primary goals of this project is to enhance state-to-state coordination, as well as enhanced coordination between states and the federal government, as well as states and local government. And so we'll be convening the states on a regional basis to help to coordinate both across agencies as well as across borders. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We'll also be providing opportunities for states to engage with utilities and partners in the private sector to identify challenges and opportunities for building the EV infrastructure market and helping to advance transportation electrification across our fleets. And then, of course, we'll be developing a number of resources and tools for state agencies to help them deliver effective and strategic and equitable EV infrastructure investment programs. And that really is at the heart of this, is we want to make sure that states have the tools that they need to be able to invest in EV charging stations in a coordinated, efficient, and equitable manner. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dave Peters at AASHTO. He and I will be co-presenting for the rest of the day. And he's going to talk a little bit about some of our next steps with coordinating between the states on a regional basis. So next slide, and Dave, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Cassie. So as Cassie mentioned, one of the ways we'll be supporting multi-state collaboration on EV infrastructure planning and deployment is through regional working groups and monthly discussions. So as you can see on this draft map of regions, these are our proposed regions that we will be having come together monthly to discuss any issues or challenges. And so later this month, we'll start holding our regional discussions, and the map you see here is the starting point for determining who's on each call. Because we want to facilitate productive and interactive discussions, we divided the country into 6 regions to keep the number of participants to a manageable size, while also helping to promote coordination along logical corridors that cross state lines, as well as collaboration with neighboring states that you might already be working with or familiar with you in your work. So we also did our best to account for the existing regional EV initiatives, which many of you are already involved with, as well as the existing regional groupings that AASHTO has, NASEO, and the Joint Office. But if any state has a strong opinion on the region that you most identify with, or states that are collaborating more closely with, let us know offline and we can make adjustments as needed. Again, this is just a draft slide, so feel free to reach out to us. And so these regional working groups will consist of representatives from state DOTs and energy offices, and we'll meet virtually on a monthly basis to share progress, concerns, successes, and challenges, with the larger goal of learning from each other and providing input to us on needs and priorities. So if we go to the next slide. So some of these more specifically discussions that we're going to target are coordinating EV infrastructure planning across state lines, including evaluating alternative fuel corridors on a regional or multi-state basis, sharing EV infrastructure build-out plans, coordinating on planning language and methodologies, and infrastructure build-out methodologies, including RFIs and RFPs, learning from each other about stakeholder engagement approaches, troubleshooting common challenges, learning about equitable program design best practices as it relates to Justice 40, and agreeing on standards where appropriate. Also during this coming year, we plan to engage the utility sector in each region to better understand the challenges and opportunities for successful coordinated regional EV infrastructure build-out. And we'll be sending out information on regional calls to EV representatives at the state DOTs and state energy offices later this week. We're aiming for Friday. Hopefully you'll see an email by then in order to start scheduling these recurring calls. And as part of this project, we're also working with several regional partners to assist in these regional coordination efforts. So really quickly, I want to give a shout out to Georgetown Climate Center, the Great Plains Institute, NESCOM, and Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability for the help that they will be providing in their regions. So if we could go to the next slide. The next piece that Cassie mentioned is regional in-person meetings. So in addition to the monthly regional conversations, we will also be convening one in-person meeting in each region to facilitate a peer exchange of best practices and lessons learned, and to enhance the state-to-state and state-to-federal coordination. These in-person events will take place during the winter, likely in the January to March timeframe, and will be held in a location convenient to the states in that region. So save the date notices and preliminary agendas will be sent out to the states later this fall. And the primary objective of the in-person meetings are anticipated to be facilitating information exchanges and strengthening connections across state lines, providing opportunities for targeted conversation with the Joint Office on program challenges, needs, and opportunities, and identifying key objectives for regional infrastructure build-out. AASHTO and NASEO will work together to share key outcomes from these meetings by preparing a summary report document, which will discuss how each of the 6 regions are working together on their EV infrastructure deployment. And the document will include technical assistance and ongoing implementation issues for the states, action items and priorities for regional infrastructure build out in the coming year, feedback on the NEVI program, including challenges, needs, and opportunities, and best practices and lessons learned in the implementation of state-led EV charging programs. So I know that was a lot of information. You'll be getting more emails about it in the coming weeks and months, but we're really looking forward to these regional discussions. And you know, we're looking forward to having you all join us. So with that, I will hand it back to Cassie, who's going to talk a little bit about our utility engagement.
Thanks, Dave. And we have already had a number of kind of questions as well as comments through the Q&A. Just as a reminder, folks can submit questions or comments anytime using that feature. But one of the things I also just wanted to add on to the discussions about convening states at the regional level is how we'll involve the environment agencies, the air agencies, and the PUCs. Obviously, the environment and the air agencies in particular have significant experience and background in investing in EV infrastructure and electrifying the fleet. Many, if not most, were leads under the Volkswagen settlement, the recipient of the Environmental Mitigation Trust funds. And so absolutely we'll want to be involving the environment and air agencies as part of these groups. We'll be chatting with our members, the state energy offices and the state DOTs about that approach. And then the PUCs, of course, are critical partners throughout all of this. And so we have been chatting a little bit with our partners at our sister associations at NARUC, at ECOS, at NACA about engaging these partners. And so we will be following up with the states with more information on that shortly. As Dave mentioned, we did want to talk a little bit about another portion of this initiative, which is engagement with the utilities. And so obviously there is a lot that is needed to explore in terms of what electric system considerations, grid enhancements, and upgrades will be needed to accommodate widespread investment in EV infrastructure. Particularly as we're talking about the power loads and requirements that will be needed to service these large stations. And so utilities in each of the regions are going to be invited to a portion of the regional discussion series to identify some of the region-specific electric system considerations and grid upgrades that will be needed as they relate to EV charging infrastructure. So we hope to have our kind of first round of discussions with utilities in the October or the November timeframe. We will be working with our partners at EEI, and we'll also be reaching out and engaging NRECA and APPA, the various associations for the investor-owned utilities, the munis, and the co-ops to identify some of the utility partners that will be appropriate and interested in engaging with the states as part of these conversations. And there will be a number of outcomes from this discussion series, but we do intend to develop case studies and lessons learned for state and utility coordinations and partnerships, specifically on EV infrastructure investment. There's a lot of nuance to get into also, whether it be options for rate structures, whether it be options for pairing EV infrastructure investments with distributed generation and storage, line extension needs, etc. And so there will be a lot to unpack through this conversation series, but we are excited to start up with that. With that, let's go to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Dave.
Great. So the next piece here is the National Convention, and this is to catalyze public-private sector collaboration. The National Convention will be the capstone meeting of this year's efforts. It'll be a national conference in May or June of next year for officials from state and federal agencies, along with representatives from utilities and private sector partners, along with some of the other partners Cassie just mentioned. And this national meeting will be a chance to learn about other states' EV deployment models, the successes they've achieved, and the challenges ahead as the program expands and matures. As NEVI is a brand new program, and as EV infrastructure deployment is bigger than just NEVI, There will be significant lessons learned from the past year and important discussions on where the effort is headed during the rest of the IIJ funding period and beyond. As we did with the as we will do with the regional in-person meetings, NASEO and AASHTO will prepare a summary report with recommendations from participants on moving the program forward, including how public-private partnerships could be leveraged to enhance EV infrastructure through the NEVI program. There's also a couple other topics listed here that the conference will explore, and we will also later today be taking some ideas down as what else we'd like to cover on the national level. So I'll hand it back over to Cassie to cover some tools and resources.
Thanks, Dave. And so as we have mentioned, one of the objectives of the project is to make sure that NASEO and AASHTO, in partnership with the Joint Office, can provide resources, analyses, tools that the states may need as they're standing up EV infrastructure, as well as their broader transportation electrification programs. And so one of the things we'll be doing is building out the EV States Clearinghouse. As many of you likely know, NASEO and AASHTO, in partnership with Atlas Public Policy, NREL, and ICF, launched a password-protected site for states earlier this year, where they can go to access information such as example RFIs and RFPs, take a look at existing state EV roadmaps, and hear about some lessons learned from states on previous EV implementation activities. We really plan to use this as a resource hub for state agencies moving forward. Some of the objectives of some of our first rounds of conversations with the states in the next 1 to 2 months will be to identify some resources and tools that will be appropriate to add to the clearinghouse. There are a number of things that we hope to add in the short term, including just a contact list that states can go to see who their peers are in other states, both in the energy offices, the DOTs, as well as the assigned NEVI program leads. We are going to be developing some tools on how states can leverage non-NEVI funds, which we'll get into in a minute, and also intend to develop really pages or hubs for the regional working groups. And so NASEO and AASHTO will be working closely with Atlas Public Policy to help to build out this site, and we hope to have some enhancements for the states quite soon. With that also, we wanted to take this opportunity to really just ask the states a couple of questions. I'm going to launch a poll. I am going to ask that only state agencies respond to this poll. This is just going to be a really quick take on what tools and resources you all think might be most helpful during the first 6 to 12 months of NEVI implementation and EV infrastructure investment under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Please feel free to respond now. And again, you should be able to kind of choose from the various options on your screen. See the answers coming in now. Also, feel free to, in the Q&A or by emailing me or Kirsten or Dave Peters, send us any other ideas for tools and resources that you think would be helpful for this project team to develop. And again, we'll have an opportunity to chat a little bit more with states about this on our first round of calls later in September. And so we still see some answers coming in, so we'll leave the poll open for just a minute more. All right, about 5 more seconds, and then I'll be closing the poll. All right, then thanks to all who responded. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. Wanted to chat a little bit more about some of the plan, tools, and resources that NASEO and AASHTO will be developing in the next few months. As I mentioned, one of the things that's been identified already by the states as something that would be helpful is really a look at what other funding pots are available for states to access to help enhance their EV infrastructure types of programs. And so in addition to the NEVI funds, there's going to be other funding for EV infrastructure investment, for example, through the discretionary charging and fueling infrastructure grants. There's also funding that's available through the Infrastructure Act for grid and resilience upgrades. There is funding available for workforce development opportunities. There are existing funding sources that was around long before the Infrastructure Act that states will be able to tap into, including, of course, things like the CMAQ funds, state energy program funds, et cetera. And so NASEO and AASHTO will be pulling together really a matrix of these various funding opportunities, as well as some recommendations for how states might be able to leverage these funds. We hope to have that analysis available later this fall. We also will be developing in the next couple of months case studies on how states are using multiple funding sources to achieve EV goals. So this will really build off of this matrix of current funding opportunities to talk about how states have tapped into other resources in the past to develop holistic EV and transportation electrification programs. And then in addition, we'll be developing model RFPs, contract documents, and other resources. The poll that you all just did will help us to identify what some of the most needed tools and resources are in the short term, and again, would welcome additional conversations with the states on that. Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Great. And so the last piece that we're going to highlight today for this program is the nationwide discussions with peers and experts. So the final activity that's part of this effort will be quarterly discussions with peers and experts on topics that the states need assistance on. And some of the areas we think might be of interest to state DOTs and state energy offices include lessons learned from the use of the Volkswagen settlement funds for EV charging infrastructure. Many states have also cited that workforce development issues will be a concern, especially with the training that might be required and the ability to find the workforce they need. The application of the Justice 40 initiative, which includes clean energy investments to the deployment of EV infrastructure, and cybersecurity is an ever-present concern, especially with the connected nature of the electrical grid and the use of electronic payment systems and so on. So we have another poll here that we're going to launch, and again, just for state agencies, but what are some of the topics that you're most interested in? We list the 4 I just mentioned here. If you have other ideas, feel free to email us those as well. I know there's a lot more that will be coming up as the program continues to grow and mature. So feel free to vote on this now, and then also send us any other ideas that might be good for one of these quarterly discussions. So we'll give it a couple minutes here to vote on the poll, and then once we're done, I'll hand it back to Cassie.
Thanks, Dave. And I see responses are still trickling into the poll, so we'll leave this open for about another 5 seconds or so. All right, I'll be closing the poll now. Thanks to all who responded. And next slide, please. All right, and with that, we want to just talk a little bit about our next steps. I know we've alluded to these throughout the webinar, but just to recap, we will be launching our first series of regional working group calls later in September. And so NASEO and AASHTO will be reaching out to state DOTs, energy offices, and then we'll work with them also to make sure that environment agencies and PUCs are involved to schedule monthly virtual discussions. Keep an eye on your inbox for an email from us in the next few business days. And again, our goal will be to schedule our first round of calls by the end of September with monthly discussions after that. We also will plan to host our first round of virtual discussions with utilities in each of the regions, ideally in the October or the November timeframe. Again, we'll be chatting with our partners at some of the industry associations to make sure that we are involving the right folks. And of course, we'll be working closely with state agencies to make sure that we structure these conversations appropriately. We also will be working to set up these in-person meetings that we've talked about, both the regional meetings that will be taking place in the January to March timeframe in each of the 6 regions, as well as the national conference, which we hope to host in May or June of next year. And so we'll be following up with states with more info on that soon. And again, we'll be working with our regional partners that Dave had identified as well to make sure that we are structuring regional conversations, both the calls as well as the in-person meetings, in a way that is additive, that builds on some of the conversations that many of these groups are hosting with states in each of the regions. And then we'll be working with our partners at Atlas Public Policy and of course all of the state agencies to help enhance the EV States Clearinghouse. We will likely have some short-term enhancements to that in the next month or so, and then we'll be building out tools and resources for the states on that slide after that. Next slide, please. One thing I will also mention is that best ways to stay in touch. And so the EV leads from the state DOTs and the energy offices have automatically been added to our listserv for this project and will receive regular announcements regarding this initiative. If you have registered for this webinar, we will also make sure to keep you in the loop and send regular updates on the project to you all. And if you are interested in receiving additional communications, please feel free to reach out to Eleni on NASEO's team. Her email address is listed here, and she will add you to our list. Next slide. With that, I believe it takes us to the end of our presentation, and so wanted to open it up to questions from the audience. And again, just a thank you to all of our partners under this project. We're excited to be working with the regional facilitators as well as Atlas to make sure that we deliver tools and resources and conversations that help the states as they invest in EV infrastructure rollout. And so we have received a number of questions through the chat. And so I know that some of the NASEO and the AASHTO teams have been responding to these in real time. And so a few of the things that we wanted to just flag through the Q&A are first of all, about we've had a number of questions regarding how we are grouping the regions. As Dave had mentioned, this is kind of our first crack at organizing each of the states into 6 regions. We did seek to try to keep existing regional collaborations together to the extent that was possible. We also know that the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation holds office hours with each of the regions, and that the states are a little bit of a different type of grouping. We are very open to restructuring these. And so if states are interested in switching regions, or after we have our first couple of calls with the states, if it makes sense for us to kind of jigger the regions in a different way, that's just fine. So please consider this a starting point. And specifically to the question about really acknowledging that a lot of the states in the Northeast, as well as the West Coast or the ZEV states, have long been working with each other to help to build complementary policies and programs. We absolutely will be working with NESCOM and Georgetown to ensure that there can be increased communications between the East and the West. All right. Another question is, have the states or joint office standardized on tools to prioritize appropriate locations to add chargers based on local requirements? That's a great question. If anyone from the joint office is on that is able to answer that question right now, certainly feel free to come online and let us know. I do know that through this initiative, we will be working closely with the states as well as the joint office to try to figure out what various EV planning tools are currently available to states. I know that one of our partners, the Great Plains Institute, is developing an EV planning infrastructure assessment tool that will be available. There's also, of course, planning tools on the AFDC, as well as tools available through various states and universities. Georgetown Climate Center has one in partnership, I believe, with MJ Bradley. So I think that an inventory is probably first in order, but we'll absolutely be looking at what types of mapping tools in particular and other tools are needed. And if any of the other speakers or representatives have anything to add, Steve?
Okay, I think that was a great response. And, you know, many states are identifying general locations, and then they'll be issuing RFPs to the private sector to come in and develop these stations. So I think it's going to be a little bit of both, utilizing tools to understand potentially where states build out beyond the minimum NEVI requirements, and then also kind of responding to proposals for building out infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Steve. All right, we have had a number of questions too about really how the private sector can be engaged, how this team as well as state agencies plan to engage the private sector. And so one of the things is that we will be inviting partners to participate on some of the regional discussions, but our in-person national convention, which again will hopefully be held in the May or June timeframe of next year, is also designed as a platform to enable not only the states to come together and to talk with partners at the federal agencies, but to also invite our partners in utilities, private sector, OEMs, et cetera, to come to share some of the best practices and lessons learned from their experience in this industry and to engage with the states. And so that will be one way of engaging. We do, as we mentioned, plan to also host some virtual forums, really with a national audience where we share best practices, not just with states, but also insights from private industry. We'll be working with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to structure those dialogues, make sure that our efforts are complementary, and we'll have more more information on that soon.
Yeah, Cassie, and I just wanted to point out too, we have a number of data and tools, resources on driveelectric.gov, which is the online home of the Joint Office. And of course, as NASEO and AASHTO are engaging with stakeholders and identifying needs, that'll be another place where we'll continue to post resources that can support states and the implementation of the NEVI formula program.
Wonderful. I do see a number of folks have also raised their hands, and so I'm going to attempt to unmute those who have raised their hands. And so first, turn to Jason Osborne to ask a question. Jason? And Jason, you may need to unmute your line from your side. All right, we'll come back to Jason then. Another question from Ben Hush. Ben, if you'd like to unmute your line. All right. Well, then in that case, we'll go back to the Q&A that came in through the chat.
So Cassie, there was a question, sorry, in here about a top 10 list of best practices to share with everyone or things to be cautious of. So I would just go back to that document that we're planning to build out after our regional meetings. I don't know if it'll be a top 10, but there will certainly be best practices highlighted from how the regions are engaging and what the states are doing, along with some of the challenges they've faced. So we will definitely have some summary documents like that to help you navigate your own challenges that you may have, or to follow some of the best practices.
Excellent, thanks, Dave. Another question that I might direct to Steve is, how will FHWA division offices be integrated to achieve consistency in implementation practices? I know that the Joint Office has been working, of course, closely with DOT and DOE, and wondering if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, so I mean, the Joint Office has been very closely engaged with the division offices and the states as we've worked through state plan development process. And then, of course, Federal Highways has its own process with the division offices to ensure consistency there. So I think, you know, if states have questions related to Title 23, that sort of thing, they should certainly be communicated up through their division offices. And I think if, you know, if the states are hearing inconsistent things, that's an opportunity, of course, for the Joint Office and division offices to work together with Federal Highways to kind of resolve some of those questions.
Great. And Steve, I know that the Joint Office doesn't is limited in what you can say about this, but there was a question on any update on when we can expect a final rule for NEVI formula funds to be released. Any insights there?
On the minimum standards?
Yeah, so
the final rule?
Yeah, the final
yeah.
rule.
Yeah, no, I don't have an update on the timing of that, but I know that the team is working to resolve many of the comments that were submitted.
Great, thanks. All right, a question.
But along those lines, Cassie, I think kind of that some of the questions that have come up where there is uncertainty, the final rulemaking with those minimum standards will be a point of gravity for consistency for states for some of the questions that have been raised.
Great. Thank you. We've received a couple of questions related to the EV States Clearinghouse. One came in as one of the early steps that many states are undertaking is developing interagencies agreements between state energy offices and state DOTs. Can states share these agreements on the EV States Clearinghouse website? The short answer is yes. If the states are comfortable with sharing it, then you are welcome to add it to the clearinghouse. States are able to log onto the clearinghouse. It's free to create an account. You just need a .gov email address. It needs to be with the state agency. Beyond that, then you can go in, log in, and upload documents. If you have any problems with uploading documents, you can email them to me and we can get them added. Another question is just who will have access to the clearinghouse. One, this site was designed initially for state agencies, so it is a password protected site. We'll be keeping it that way for the time being. And so the idea is that it will be a place where states can share documents, both documents that are in progress as well as final items that they would like to make sure are available to their peers. Our federal partners will have access as well as the partners on the project. So the conveners of the different regional initiatives, et cetera. And a couple questions too about slides and the recording. This recording will be available to all, and the slides will also be made available. So no problem there. And then we did have a question also come in about, will the discussion with utilities in October and November include the state DOTs in the regions where the utilities are located? Absolutely. And so one of the purposes of the discussion series with utilities is to help facilitate dialogue between the state departments of transportation, state energy offices, other state agencies as appropriate, as well as the utilities. So help to build those relationships, the connections, and really make sure that everyone is starting off with kind of a level piece of information and have appropriate points of contact in the utility sector. All right. We have a technical question, which I'll open up maybe to folks from the joint office if you happen to know this, and if not, we'll add it to our list of questions. Does anyone know offhand how many square feet of solar panels would be needed to power a NEVI compliant charging station? As a reminder, for NEVI compliance, these stations have to be powered at 150 kWs, and there will need to be 4 at a site.
It's a great question, right? I mean, I think in large, there are some stations that could benefit from on-site generation. I doubt we'll see any that are fully powered by solar. And I think it also depends on the utilization, right? If all four ports are being used at once, you need enough for that, but maybe you could get by with less.
Good answer. All right. Another question really on the Buy America side of things. And so this is something we did not address in this presentation, but will be explored pretty thoroughly in our conversations with the regions. We know that the Buy America requirements under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act are strict. And so just a question on, would Buy America clause for EV charging stations be incorporated, and how? Steve, if you have any insights on that, please go ahead and share. Otherwise, just to know that we will continue to explore this during the regional dialogues.
Yeah, definitely something we'll explore.
All right. Sounds great. All right, well, I think we'll take maybe just 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap up. And so one of the questions too is just how states can really gain access to counterparts at DOE as well as DOT. We know the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is the joint office bringing together partners in both of those agencies. And so just wondering, Steve, to what extent you see DOE and DOT participants chatting with states in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the joint office, of course, is comprised of representatives from national labs and Department of Energy and Department of Transportation, and we're closely connected with, Federal Highways and Federal Transit Administration, and then folks in the Vehicle Technologies Office. So there's quite a lot of collaboration happening already within the joint office. And then we're, of course, leading on our colleagues in the different departments to bring resources to bear. So, just as an example, Office of Electricity has been developing resources. There's the EV Grid Assist program that's accelerating the transition to transportation electrification. So, a lot of that stuff is shared on driveelectric.gov or even on the EV States Clearinghouse. So we're already starting to bring a lot of those resources to bear to support states. I think one of the other things I wanted to mention too is the question about Buy America requirements. There is an open request for information right now on proposed waiver for Buy America. So that's something that we'll be sharing, if you don't have the link to that already, in the joint office newsletter that'll come out next week.
Great, thanks. All right, most of the rest of our questions are technical questions, which I think we will keep and likely share it with some of the technical experts, both at the joint office as well as folks on the NASEO and AASHTO teams to get back to you. There is one final question I wanted to just raise, which how does funding for the project implementation become available for city, urban, and suburban and county rural communities? And are the state DOTs the ones who will be streamlining that process? One thing I'll just note is that a lot of the conversation in the first few months in particular with this initiative will focus on the NEVI program, both planning and implementation. And NEVI does focus on investing in fast chargers along corridors, and so specifically alternative fuel corridors and interstates across the country. And so there will, however, be another round of discretionary grants available, or competitive grants available for states and local governments coming out later this fall or sometime next year, the charging and fueling infrastructure grants, which states, cities, municipalities, et cetera, will be able to apply for. I know that many of our members have been getting questions from counties and cities about how they may not be eligible for receiving NEVI funds because they're too far off of a highway, but they're interested in building out their EV infrastructure. And so what can they do? And I think that a really great opportunity will be to keep an eye out for funding through that program. And so Dave, I know that you've also been chatting with your members at AASHTO, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, very similar to what you said, just keeping an eye out for the announcements and the guidance on that, but it'll be a good opportunity. I believe $2.5 billion over the next 5 years for that program. So community and charging grants for alternate fuels as well. So similar questions and very similar response. Keep an eye out for it. And if you have any questions once the guidance comes out, feel free to reach out to us.
Wonderful. And so with that, we do still have, again, some questions in the queue, but most, I believe, are technical questions. We will, however, be keeping a list of all of these, and so can follow up with those who have asked. One of the things that have also come up in our conversations with the states is just a rolling FAQ. I know that the Joint Office has one for questions specifically regarding the NEVI program. We can likely also look into developing a similar one for just general questions about EV infrastructure investment and specifically best practices between states. And so another good thing for us to potentially explore. But I think with that, we will wrap up our webinar. And so I would like to just thank AASHTO as well as the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. We are very excited to be working with you on this project. And I thank you to all of the state energy offices, state DOTs, environment agencies, PUCs, utilities, and private sector partners who joined us to learn a little bit about this initiative. Again, we'll be reaching out to states in the next few days to set up our first round of calls. And a big thank you to our regional partners as well as Atlas Public Policy for your support with this project. We're looking forward to working with you. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Kirsten, or Dave. And with that, we will sign off. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Goodbye.